Good morning. We've been studying this series of lessons about early history in terms of biblical narrative. We are covering it in somewhat survey style, although I told you a couple classes ago that felt like we sometimes are going just a little too fast, and so I slowed it down enough to where we're covering a lesson basically in two class periods rather than a lesson per class. But I didn't even quite get lesson 7 done Wednesday. The very last point that lesson 7 makes, I'll show it to you on the screen if you don't have it in front of you. Oh, maybe I won't because I forgot to pull it up. But so we're going to briefly talk just about kind of leading into lesson 8. So lesson 8 is really where we're going to be here in just a moment. I do want to bring one thing up to you. We had a question. And I don't even know whether I should bring the question back up because I really don't even have an answer in terms of because I can't. You can't. The question came up late in our study, and I was scrambling in my own mind to try to come up with exactly who was under the discussion. But the question basically related to what kind of relationship would the Pharaoh have had with Moses if he grew up in the palace and that kind of thing, and then who were they? Was it the same one when Moses was born? Is that the same Pharaoh when he comes back 80 years later? He's 40 years there, 40 years gone, then back, and is it the same one? And those kinds of questions. And the answer to that is nobody really knows. You don't know. We could theorize, right? And it's interesting because there are those who would go to Egyptian historical documents and basically argue that it didn't exist, that they were never there, and that the Exodus was a folklore, it's a story, and never happened. And the reason for that is because the Egyptians don't really talk about it in their historical narrative. And some say if you had such a tremendous event like that, you think it would probably get written down in history. But that's not necessarily true, because is it very redeeming in relationship to the Egyptians? No, so you may not necessarily write those things down. There are some conjecture, depends, Zane brought up for us Wednesday night, it depends on whether or not you take an early date or a later date in terms of just looking at it from archaeological reasons and things. But the truth is, we're not going to ever be able to answer that. We're not told in the biblical narrative. We don't know for sure in terms of trying to compare Egyptian records to the biblical narrative. So you're just not going to know. So the answer is we don't know. Most likely, just because of the age situation, circumstances, that most likely you're dealing with a different Pharaoh, probably a son or somebody that he had placed in power, maybe even somebody that was highly regarded and high up in authority when Moses was being raised. But most likely somebody different. But again, there's no way to tell for sure. And that kind of thing happens historically, by the way. I can illustrate that to you maybe real quick, and I debate whether to try to do this or not. But this may fall completely flat if somebody doesn't tell me the answer to this. But tell me, why is the penitentiary in Moundsville? They had a choice between that and the university. Would it shock you to find that the fellow that runs all things that happen in the old penitentiary, is a friend of mine? And he would tell you that there's absolutely not a single shred of evidence that is actually true. He said he has dug through the archives and dug through the archives and dug through the archives, and there is not a single shred of evidence. In fact, he theorizes that most likely, through reading that history, that simply what happened was, where was the first capital? Wheeling. And where do you want your prison? Not far from your seat of authority. And so you'd build your first prison, your first state prison, not far from Wheeling. And I just simply, not to embarrass you, because I would have answered it the same way, right? Because that's what we've been trained to believe, that Moundsville was offered the penitentiary or the university, and they felt from a financial standpoint they'd actually be more in jobs. And in that day, it's probably true, by the way, prison would have probably brought more jobs and opportunities than a university would, because not as many people went to universities back in those days. But it's just interesting. We get those historical narratives in our minds, and we're told them over and over and over and over and over again. But there's no documentation, no historical record whatsoever that this fellow that runs the penitentiary up there could find that ever indicates that that is true. But yet it's just been told long enough. So my point is this: history can be fuzzy, right? History can be fuzzy. It's not always as accurate, and sometimes depending on the historian and what's their perspective and what are they do they have an agenda? Do they have a reason that is motivating them to tell a piece of history? One of the things that, just to illustrate it one more time, is the same fellow I'm telling you about. One of the first things he did when he became in charge of the facility up there was he brought all the tour guides in and he said, "Here's the script, here's the story," and not relating to that, to relating to everything, because to make the tour interesting, they were just telling whatever they wanted to tell, and just whatever sounded interesting to them. And so he said, let's get as best we can, an accurate depiction of what went on and what happened in this place, and let everybody that comes through the door get the same message. And so history's odd sometimes when it comes to trying to figure some of those things out. And so just keep that in mind. That we simply don't know for sure who these pharaohs were, in terms of, we know who the pharaohs were, I should say, but we don't know which one in particular happened to be in charge when these events occurred. So it's hard for us to kind of answer that question. Then what kind of relationship would he have had with Moses in the early goings, and what kind of relationship would he have had when Moses returns? It's just too difficult to try to understand it. All right, so we've been through the plagues, we've been through the Exodus, and we've been through just an understanding that what kind of, if you were to pick one word that described the attitude of the Israelites over and over and over again, what would it be? Complain or murmurs, right? Every time some challenge comes along, they begin to complain and to murmur, and they direct that towards Moses and Aaron. But Moses repeatedly tells them, "You're not really upset with me, you're upset with God." And so that's been the situation over and over again. And we looked at those events, some of them, on Wednesday. But we run into a situation now. You've got an estimated how many? Yeah, probably a couple million folk, probably somewhere around that area. It's a lot of folks. And how had they been governed? This is not a trick question, just think about it for a second. How had they been governed up until they left? By the Egyptian rule, right? So they weren't necessarily governing themselves. And so now all of a sudden you've got to figure out, how are we going to make decisions and choices, and how are we going to handle disputes? And you can only imagine with 2 million people, and you're trotting along, trying to make it back to Canaan, that you're going to have some issues. There are going to be some things come up. And so how will they handle that according to Exodus chapter 18? Okay, well, initially, though, how are they handling it? Go to Moses, right? And who shows up on the scene? Jethro's father-in-law. And here's Moses, and he sees one person after another bringing dispute after dispute after dispute towards Moses. And basically, what does he say? Yeah, it's too much. You're going to what? You're going to wear yourself. Yeah, you're going to wear yourself out. You're going to wear yourself out if you sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning unto even. There in verse 14. So you think about that. Not a lot else getting done from the beginning of the morning till evening. All Moses is doing is sitting there resolving disputes and trying to make judgments about things that keep coming to him. And Moses says, well, basically in verse 15, well, what am I supposed to do? People keep coming to me, inquiring of how God would want us to handle certain things. When they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and His laws. Now that's somewhat interesting, right? Why is that somewhat interesting? Okay, so chapter 19, chronologically here, is when we're going to start actually getting Moses and having him go to Sinai and receive. But it's obvious then by Moses' statement, though, that God has been giving him what? Some instructions, some laws, some rules, some guidance along the way here that he's using to make these decisions and choices as it relates to these disputes that come. There's a bigger event that's on the way that has more, I don't care how I shape it, but in some ways has more to do with the covenant that God is going to make with them. Not that God had never given them an instruction or a law or something that was a rule that they needed to abide by up until Sinai, but there's a sealing of that covenant relationship when He provides that law at Sinai and says, this is how it's going to be. There's just a different sense maybe from that. So his father-in-law says it's not good that you're doing. Surely, verse 18, you're going to wear yourself away. And so what's his suggestion? Okay, so if God's willing, if it's, inquire, but if it works in God's will, then why not establish some judges that can come and judge over the people? And if it's a great matter, it gets to you, but if it's a smaller matter, let these other men handle that. And so he listened, verse 24. And they chose able men in verse 25 out of all of Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands. We said there are a lot of people. So there's rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And so they established a hierarchy where they would be able to govern, and depending on what kind of matter it was, maybe the guy over the 10 could handle it. And if he didn't think he could, he kicked it up to the 50 or up to the 100 or up to the 1,000. And then if that person in that chain couldn't handle it, then you kick it on up to Moses and let him handle the weightier matters. And so they just set up somewhat of a judicial system in order to be able to handle that. And we've got the same kinds of things, right? We might have a magistrate, and you might kick it up to some kind of regional court, or depending on what kind of offense it is, whether it's a state or a federal offense. You have appellate courts or whatever as you work your way up to ultimately the Supreme Court of the state or the Supreme Court of the United States. And so they're setting up a way to govern themselves as we lead into receiving the weightier matters, if you will, of the law. And it's somewhat, and it makes that note back in the lesson sheets at the end of lesson 7, when he said, this foreshadows the establishment of a comprehensive law between God and Israel, which will further define the people as a nation and preserve them unto God's future purpose for them. And so it begins that process of them beginning to grasp that relationship. So what was Moses making known to the people even before Mount Sinai then? We kind of just answered that. Yeah, statutes, laws, there were things that he had been given. How might this principle bear upon the plurality of elders in a congregation? Yeah, it's too much for one man. It's concerning as it relates to making those choices and decisions, and the larger the number of people and issues that come up, then the more important it is to have that plurality. It's interesting. Sometimes when you're using somebody else's material, you can't help but think in your own mind, okay, what was going on in that guy's preaching life that he throws that kind of question in the middle of that. But anyway, it is a worthy thought anyway as it relates to those things. All right, lesson 8. Lesson 8. So these folks are going to become a very special and peculiar people to God. They're going to maintain that relationship till the time that Jesus ultimately comes on the scene. And so God's going to have to give them something to govern them as a nation. It's very different when you think about it. It's a very different kind of circumstance. We've said this before, but what's peculiar in some ways about their relationship with God is their laws were both civil and spiritual. We understand the concept of separation of law. We have physical laws, man-made laws that govern us as a nation, as citizens. And then we have God's laws, spiritual laws, that are separate and apart and distinct from the laws of the land. Their law of the land was the law of God, and the law of God was the law of the land. There wasn't a distinction in relationship to that. God provided both things that pertain to their spiritual relationship, and He also gave them laws and instructions that pertain to how they should conduct themselves as a nation, as a physical nation of people. And this process of kind of coming back to those original promises that were made to whom? To Abraham, right? Don't forget that's the beginning point of all these things to Abraham. So let's go into chapter 19. Let's take a look. Exodus chapter 19. All right. So again, not a tremendous amount of time has gone by. Some were in the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. For they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel. And so you've got this beginning point where he has yet another conversation, in a sense, with God as he's going to begin to give him laws and instructions as it relates to them. Keep reading. You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Now, will God honor the promise made to Abraham no matter what? Yes. Will God bless and treasure them as a people no matter what? No. God's going to honor the promise because the covenant is a covenant. He enters into that covenant, and we've even seen it. It didn't take but one child, right, for us to learn. Abraham, Isaac. By the time you get to Isaac, we're already hearing things like, because of your father Abraham. Because of your father Abraham. Get to Jacob. Because of Abraham. I'm going to honor the promise. I'm going to honor the covenant. So God's made a promise. He's made a covenant. Jesus is coming, irregardless of the conduct and behavior of the people. But if they want to be treasured and blessed and honored and have all the benefits of a God who can care for them, who can bring them out of bondage through eagle's wings, who can provide all this benefit, if you want that peculiar treasure relationship, you're going to have to obey my voice. Fast forward for a moment, does that happen? When do they receive the blessings of God? When they obey His voice. You go through the whole history, and when they begin to deny Him and reject Him, blessings go away, and trouble comes. Exactly what He tells Moses here is exactly what happens in the historical narrative. When you go back and look at all the events that happened from this point forward. He says, You shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Ooh, that sounds interesting, right? Where do we hear that sentiment? It's 1 Peter 2, but you thinking about this relationship that he had with in the transition between this relationship he had with the Israelites, but he offers that same relationship to us, Christians. And you think about this peculiar people and the opportunity to be a royal priesthood to God. That's the same sentiment he says to the people in Moses' day. It's the same principle. He says this about them. You have this great opportunity to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. Now, ultimately, they're going to establish a physical priesthood out of the tribe of Levi, but the nation as a whole is described in the early stages as a nation of priests, servants, people who would honor God. That's what they were intended for. Same sentiment is shared about us in New Testament times. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people, those ones they had just set up. and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord hath spoken we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord, and the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people, and the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. So far, so what? So far, so good, right? So far, so good. God tells Moses, listen, we're going to give you some instructions. I'll bless them. I'll benefit them. There'll be a priesthood. All this honor, all these things are going to come if they obey my voice, listen to my commands. And the people say, amen to that. Yeah, absolutely. It's exactly what we want to do. But the problem is it doesn't what? It's not going to last. They're going to, and in fact, they're going to grow pretty impatient pretty quickly. In some senses, we'll see as we move forward here in a moment. But just so we're processing the material, right? So does God propose, this is question 1, does God propose to make this covenant with all people of the earth? No. Not this time. He does later when we talk about that one in the new covenant. But this one, no, I won't bless other people in the same way I'm going to bless you, he said. Does the special covenant with Israel mean that other nations would be without any laws from God? No, just because he governs them in a peculiar way doesn't mean that his instructions, and I think, well, who do we generally point to in the New Testament that kind of illustrates that? Cornelius, right? We generally point to Cornelius, that first Gentile convert who is obviously a worshiper of God, somebody who's respecting and honoring God, but not from a Hebrew or Jewish law standpoint, from a different mindset and relationship. Well, why did God speak with Moses in the thick cloud? Okay. To promote, when I speak with thee and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord, so that there would be this undeniable visual and emotional reaction to this is legitimate. What Moses is providing for you is legitimate. And you can't reject it, or you can't turn away from Moses because of it. You're going to have to stay true to what he gives them. So God comes on the scene in relationship to bringing these instructions and laws. He tells them to do what in verse 10? Sanctify. So today and tomorrow, let them wash their clothes and be ready against the third day. For the third day, the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. And I'll try not to be overly speculative here, but you think there's just pure coincidence that on the third day? I don't know. It could be, I suppose, but I think there's some significance to that idea here, that on the third day. And that becomes then a repeated phrase when the promise that these folks are supposed to be honoring and bringing us to, when Jesus said, I will on the third day raise this temple back up again. Anyway, just food for thought. Thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying what? Yeah, be careful. Take heed to yourselves. Do not go up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. You ever been in a museum and seen one of those exhibits, and it's obvious a look don't touch exhibit because they've got that extra. Whether I should tell you this story or not, maybe I shouldn't. But I was at the Ford's Museum up in Detroit years ago, and keep in mind I was young, right, young, and the car that JFK was in was there on display. I can't turn that off, can I? Can I? Is there statute of limitations? I touched it. Had to. Felt like I needed to connect the history, right? Mine weren't the only fingerprints on it, by the way. But they could have thrown me out, right? They could have asked me to leave. They would have had every right to do so, because I broke the boundary. A boundary had been set up, and God says, "Listen, I don't want them. I don't. You're going to come, but I don't want you, right?" And so, and just to make sure, set bounds. Make sure they know where they are. Make sure they know what you mean when you say, "Don't come any further than here," when it relates to this mountain. He's very. All I'm trying to illustrate to you is he's very clear, right? There's no. The law. Even in the beginning points of receiving the law, is very detailed. And when you begin to see the law itself, and you begin to see the cleansing rituals and the things that they have to do, I mean, it's detailed of exactly what's going to happen, even from the beginning. Don't touch it. There shall not an hand touch it. He shall surely be stoned and shot through, whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mountain. Any ambiguity there? You see any confusion? You either stone them, shoot them through, beast or man, they shall not live. He's pretty clear what the rules are about whether or not they need to respect the boundaries of the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain unto the people and sanctified the people. They washed their clothes like they'd been told to do. He says to the people, "Be ready against the third day. Come not at your wives, purity." And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp did what? Trembled. You are coming into the presence of Jehovah. You have been taught for 400 years about God after God after God after God. One of the river, one of the sun, one of the moon. For 400 years you've been in Egypt. You've been learning about all these gods that the Egyptians had worshipped. And you've adopted their culture. And through that time you've kind of forgotten who the I Am was and is. And so there's not going to be any shred of doubt. Shouldn't be any shred of doubt when they're done. That this is Jehovah. This is the I Am. And their initial reaction is exactly like you would expect. Lightnings, thunder, dark cloud, trumpet voice. They're trembling. Moses brings forth the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on the smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace. And the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. And so it's hard to even fathom this scene and the responses of the people at such a tremendous moment. And you just the rumbling of the mountain and the sound of this voice, and this trumpet sound, and all the lightning and the thunder, and then all that trumpet sound gets longer and louder and louder. The presence of God is upon them. And it's a powerful, powerful scene to consider. Thoughts or questions up to that point? All right, so let's jump ahead a little bit here. Let's go into chapter 20. I want to look. Oops, sorry about that. So in chapter 20, you get kind of the basis of the law. Are there going to be other instructions? Yeah, but here are the 10 that kind of set the stage, in a sense, for all the others. And you think about other laws and guidelines and statutes that they're going to come, that they're going to have to respect and honor. But you think about them, they probably, if you thought for a moment, you'd see how all of them kind of relate and reconnect to these basic principles that are first established. So he said, the first, verse 3, thou shalt what? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Honor me and only me. Give me the respect I do and do. Thou shalt not have what? Don't make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. What had they been seeing for 400 years? Yeah, image after image after image after image after image of things from the heavens, things from the sea, things from the earth. Everywhere you turn, you would see some form of idolatry among the Egyptians. And so it's not unusual, or even something that seems, why would God want to give this as a primary law? He's trying to pull them out of that. Remember, what's the first thing they do when they get a little bit concerned that Moses didn't come back? They build an idol. Okay, they build an idol. Very first thing they do when they decide that Moses has been gone too long. No wonder God wants in the statute, don't do that. Don't build images and things that you begin to bow yourself down to. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. We'll talk about that in here in just a moment. But it's interesting that he notes that he did. So, could you have a picture of a golden? I mean, I don't know whether you would, but could you have a picture of a cow in your house? Yes, right? He's not talking about the idea that you're not allowed to have an image of something in your home or in your, because what's the emphasis in verse 5? Yeah, they're worshiping these images, okay? So the idea isn't that you can't depict something. He's saying don't create images and idols that you then begin to bow yourself down to or serve them as if they're a real God. Because I'm what? God said. I'm a jealous God. That's an interesting description of God that I don't know that we often talk. Because generally speaking, if I said the word jealousy, would you have a positive or a negative connotation to it? Negative, right? Generally, if I say somebody's a jealous person, that's not a compliment, right? Generally, that's not a compliment. When it comes to God, it's a manner in which He emphasizes the importance of placing Him above all other things. God says, I don't like it. I don't approve of it. I don't appreciate it when people put me somewhere other than on the top of their list. Has that character of God ever changed? No. It's been there forever. That character trait, if you will, of God has always been around. He has to be the first and foremost in all things. Because I'm a jealous God. So much so that sometimes the consequences that come upon the generation who leaves God has lasting effects for what? For generation after generation after generation, he said. It's that important. What I appreciate about that, and not to turn this into sermon form, but what I appreciate about that is that what I do has a greater impact than I realize sometimes. Choices and decisions I make about my relationship with God can have an impact not just on me. Now, they in terms of judgment, eternal decisions, and judged one-on-one. Nobody has an excuse. Nobody can, but I can set a stage. A generation can set a stage that creates problems for a generation to the next generation to the next generation. And so be careful. Be careful. But he also can do what in verse 6? I can also show mercy to the thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. And so don't put anything else above me. What's the next? Yeah, thou shalt not, verse 7, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Let me just ask it this way. What's that mean? Take the Lord's name in vain. Okay? Say it one more time. To misuse it? Okay, to curse the name of the Lord? Say that one more time, Bob. I'll come back. Okay? To use it in a way that makes it meaningless or unimportant? Okay, in a disrespectful or a way that isn't filled with worship in its tone and purpose. The word vain simply means what? Empty, right? The word vain simply just means empty, worthless, useless, and I guess maybe the point I want to make is when we emphasize that, here's how we emphasize it. We say, so you shouldn't say what? See, I can't even say it in our class because we say it, right? Right? Yeah. So don't say it. Don't abbreviate it. You just don't. And certainly don't attach his name to a string of curse words after it either, right? That's the image. And all that's right, okay? We shouldn't. It's God's name isn't intended for, oh, I'm excited. Ed McMahon's just, anyway, I don't know whether he, did you understand? I just won $1 million, and so here it goes. Or right? So it shouldn't be used in a moment of excitement. It certainly shouldn't be used in a vulgarity, right? But here's my point. That's not the only way God's name can be used in vain, useless, empty, meaningless ways. If we make praise the Lord, you ever said it and not mean it? And here's my point. That's using the Lord's name in vain. If we make a statement, praise the Lord, but I don't have any part of praise. I just used his name in an empty, useless, meaningless way. And my point is don't take the Lord's name in vain as simply don't use it in a cursing situation or it has deeper thought than that we need to recognize and appreciate. Okay. We'll come back into the 10, Lord willing, Wednesday, finish up our discussion here out of lesson 8. And I think we've got plenty of time Wednesday to